The stars looked cold and distant through the window of the UES horizon, as Captain Jake Morrison checked the ship's navigation systems one more time. They had been mapping this empty region of space for 3 weeks now, and found nothing but dust and rocks floating in the darkness. His crew was getting restless, and Jake could not blame them. Lisa Chang sat at the pilot controls with her fingers dancing across the holographic displays. She had been flying ships since she was 16, and could make the horizon dance through space like a leaf in the wind. Behind her, Bobby Torres was fixing something that probably did not need fixing, but keeping busy helped pass the time on these long survey missions. Amy Carter stood near the science station reading data streams that showed the same empty readings they had been seeing for days. Jake was about to order them to move to the next sector when Amy suddenly straightened up and called out to everyone. The sensors had picked up something massive just beyond the edge of their scanning range. It was big enough to be a small moon, but it was moving in a pattern that suggested it was artificial. Jake felt his heart beat faster as he ordered Lisa to change course toward the unknown object. As they got closer, the thing on their screens became stranger and more mysterious. It was definitely a ship, but unlike anything in their database of known alien vessels. The hull seemed to be made from some kind of living metal that curved and flowed like water frozen in time. Parts of it looked like crystal formations that caught and reflected the light from distant stars. The ship was nearly 10 kilometers long and shaped like a massive predator fish with fins and spines jutting out at odd angles. Lisa brought them in closer, while Bobby ran every scan he could think of. The readings were confusing and contradictory. Parts of the ship showed no life signs at all, while other sections pulsed with energy patterns that made no sense. Amy was practically vibrating with excitement as she studied the data and tried to figure out what they were looking at. Jake knew he should report this discovery to Earth Command and wait for orders, but something about the ship called to him. It was clearly damaged, with huge tears in the hull and sections that looked like they had been blasted by weapons beyond anything humans had ever built. Whatever had attacked this vessel had been trying very hard to destroy it completely. He made the decision that would change everything. Jake ordered Lisa to dock with the alien ship. Bobby found an airlock that seemed compatible with their equipment and managed to create a seal between the two vessels. The atmosphere inside the alien ship was breathable, but thick with the smell of ozone and something metallic that made their teeth ache. Jake led the way with his sidearm drawn, while Amy followed with her scanning equipment, and Lisa stayed behind to monitor their life signs. The corridors inside the ship were huge and designed for beings much larger than humans. The walls curved up into darkness above their heads, and strange symbols glowed with soft blue light along the floor. Their footsteps echoed strangely, as if the metal under their feet was alive and listening to every sound they made. They found bodies in the first chamber they entered. The aliens were enormous, with 4 arms and legs like tree trunks. Their skin looked like natural armor plating, and their heads were shaped like the skulls of ancient Earth predators. Even dead, they looked dangerous and powerful. Amy took readings while Jake studied the weapons scattered around the room. The aliens had been fighting something and losing badly. Bobby called them over to a section of the wall where strange tubes and cables disappeared into the ship's structure. His engineering experience told him this was some kind of life support system, and it was still partially active. Amy's scanner showed one life sign somewhere deeper in the ship, and Jake felt his pulse quicken as he realized they might not be alone. They followed the corridors, deeper into the vessel, until they found a chamber filled with pods that looked like metallic cocoons. Most of them were dark and cold, but one in the center of the room hummed with energy and glowed with the same blue light they had seen throughout the ship. Through the transparent surface, they could see the outline of something large and definitely alive. Jake approached the pod carefully while Amy ran her scanners over the surface, looking for any kind of control mechanism. The being inside was massive, even compared to the dead aliens they had found earlier. It had the same 4 arms and armored skin, but there was something different about this one. Even unconscious, it radiated a sense of power and authority that made Jake's military instincts stand at attention. Amy found what looked like activation controls and looked at Jake with questioning eyes. This was the moment of truth. They could leave the alien sleeping and report their discovery to Earth Command, or they could wake it up and face whatever consequences followed. Jake thought about all the training simulations he had run about first, contact protocols, and then ignored every single one of them. He nodded to Amy, and she pressed the control sequence. The pod began to drain of the blue liquid that had kept its occupant alive for who knew how long. Systems throughout the ship started to activate as if the sleeping alien had been connected to every circuit and computer. Warning lights flashed and alien voices spoke in languages none of them could understand. The pod opened with a sound like breaking glass, and the creature inside took its first breath in what might have been centuries. Its eyes opened and focused on Jake with an intelligence that was clearly not human, but definitely aware and dangerous. The alien was even larger than Jake had thought, with muscles that looked like they could crush steel and claws that could tear through their ship's hull. It spoke in a voice like grinding stone, and Jake had no idea what it was saying, but the tone was clearly a challenge or a question. Amy's translation software was trying to work with the alien language but getting nowhere. Jake did the only thing that made sense to him. He held up his hands to show he was not holding a weapon and spoke in the calmest voice he could manage. The alien stared at him for a long moment and then did something that surprised everyone. It laughed. The sound was like rocks falling down a mountain, but there was definitely humor in it. The creature spoke again, and this time Amy's software caught a few words that might have meant greeting or acknowledgement. Jake Morrison had just made first contact with something that would change the course of human history forever, and he had no idea what he was supposed to do next. The alien warrior stood slowly, and Jake could see just how massive he really was. The creature towered over them like a living mountain with 4 arms that looked like they could bend steel bars. His skin was dark gray with natural armor plates that covered his chest and shoulders. Scars crisscrossed his body, telling stories of battles that Jake could only imagine. Amy's translation software finally started to make sense of the alien's language, and she called out that his name was something like Kethvar. He was asking where his warriors were and what had happened to his ship. When Amy tried to explain that everyone else was dead, the alien's face showed grief that looked surprisingly human despite his fearsome appearance. Jake stepped forward, despite every instinct telling him to run. He spoke slowly and clearly while Amy translated his words into the alien language. They had found his ship drifting in space, and everyone aboard was already gone when they arrived. Jake offered to help treat any injuries and provide food or water if needed. Kethvar stared at Jake for a long moment as if trying to understand why such a small creature would offer help to someone who could crush him without effort. The alien spoke again, and Amy translated that he was asking why Jake was not afraid. Jake thought about the question and answered honestly. That fear would not help anyone, right? Now when they had medical supplies that might work on alien biology. The warrior seemed amused by this response and allowed Jake to examine the wounds on his arms and chest. Most of them had healed during his long sleep, but some still showed signs of infection or damage. Jake cleaned and bandaged what he could while Bobby brought medical supplies from their ship. Lisa stayed at the controls but kept watching the alien with obvious nervousness. As Jake worked on treating the wounds, Kethvar began to tell them about the battle that had damaged his ship. Amy's translation was getting better, and they learned about an enemy called the Void Hunters that consumed entire worlds. The warriors' people called themselves the Vorthak, and they had been fighting this enemy for thousands of years. Kethvar was something called an apex warrior, which seemed to mean he was one of the best fighters in the entire galaxy. Jake found himself fascinated by the alien stories of battles across star systems and wars that lasted for centuries. The Vorthak sounded like a race of professional soldiers who lived for combat and honor. Kethvar seemed surprised that humans also had warriors, and asked Jake about his own military experience. Jake told him about serving as a Marine and fighting in conflicts on distant colonies. He described the training and discipline required to be a good soldier, and the bonds formed between warriors who faced danger together. Kethvar listened with growing interest and spoke of similar traditions among his own people. Their conversation was interrupted when Bobby called out a warning from his sensor station. The ship's automatic systems were coming online, and some of them were not happy about having strangers aboard. Defense turrets were powering up throughout. The vessel and targeting systems were trying to lock onto the human crew. Kethvar roared something that Amy translated as commands to shut down the defensive systems, but the ship's computer did not recognize his voice after so many years in stasis. The weapons were designed to kill any intruders, and they would fire in less than 5 minutes. The alien tried to reach the control systems, but his injuries slowed him down, and the control room was too far away. Jake studied the ship's layout on Bobby's scanner and saw that the main computer core was located in a section of the ship that was heavily damaged and leaking radiation. The only way to manually shut down the defensive systems was to go into that area and physically disconnect the power relays. The radiation levels would kill a human in minutes, but it was the only chance they had. Kethvar saw what Jake was looking at and shook his massive head. He said no soft-skinned creature could survive in that section, and even his own armored hide would be damaged by the radiation. Jake looked at his crew and saw the fear in their eyes. Lisa was already calculating how long it would take to reach their ship and escape, but Jake knew they would never make it in time. He grabbed an emergency radiation suit from their supplies and started putting it on despite the protest from everyone around him. Jake had made his decision and nothing was going to change his mind. He told Bobby to guide him through the ship's communication system and asked Amy to translate any important warnings or instructions they might encounter. Kethvar grabbed Jake's arm with one massive hand and spoke urgently to Amy. The translation came back as a demand to know why Jake would risk his life for strangers. Jake looked up at the towering alien warrior and gave the only answer that made sense to him. They were not strangers anymore, and leaving people to die was not something he could live with. The warrior released his grip and stepped back with something that might have been respect in his dark eyes. Jake ran through the corridors of the alien ship following Bobby's directions, while radiation alarms screamed around him. The suit's protection was minimal, and he could feel the heat building. Up inside the protective gear, he found the computer core in a chamber that glowed with deadly energy and worked frantically to disconnect the power relays that controlled the defensive systems. His hands shook from radiation exposure, and the suit's systems were failing, but he managed to cut the connections just as the turrets were about to fire. Jake collapsed on the metal floor as his body finally gave in to the radiation poisoning. He could hear Bobby and Amy calling his name through the communications system, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was Kethvar running toward him with medical equipment in his forearms. When Jake woke up, he was lying on a medical table in their ship with Amy and Bobby working frantically over him with both human and alien medical technology. Kethvar stood nearby holding devices that looked like they belonged in a hospital from the future. The alien warrior had somehow carried Jake back to safety and was now helping to save his life. Amy told him that the radiation should have killed him, but the alien medical equipment was filtering the poison from his blood. Kethvar spoke, and Amy translated that he had never seen such courage from any warrior of any species. The alien had performed some kind of ritual while Jake was unconscious that Amy said meant he was acknowledging Jake as a true fighter worthy of respect. Jake tried to sit up, but his body was still weak from the radiation exposure. Kethvar gently pushed him back down and spoke again. Amy's translation made Jake's heart race with surprise. The alien warrior had called him brother. Jake spent 2 days recovering from the radiation poisoning while Kethvar shared more details about the enemy that had destroyed his ship. The Void Hunters were not alive in any way that made sense to organic beings. They were machines that had been built by some ancient race that was now extinct. These machines had one purpose, and that was to consume every living thing in the galaxy. Amy worked with the alien warrior to understand more about this threat while Bobby studied the Vorthak technology that had saved Jake's life. The engineering was beyond anything humans had developed and seemed to work by manipulating matter at the molecular level. Lisa kept the ship ready for immediate departure because she had a bad feeling about staying in one place for too long. Kethvar explained that his people had been fighting the Void Hunters for over 3,000 years. The machines would appear without warning and strip entire planets of all life before moving on to the next target. The Vorthak were warriors by nature and had dedicated their entire civilization to stopping this threat. They had won many battles, but the war seemed endless because the machines could rebuild themselves from any available materials. Jake asked why other species in the galaxy did not help fight this enemy, and Kethvar's expression grew dark. Most races were too weak or too frightened to stand against the Void Hunters. The Vorthak had tried to form alliances before, but other species preferred to hide and hope the machines would not find them. This had made the Vorthak bitter and convinced them that they were the only ones capable of real warfare. The conversation was interrupted when Bobby's sensors detected movement in the space around them. 3 ships that looked like black metal spiders were approaching fast, and their energy signatures matched the descriptions of Void Hunter vessels that Kethvar had given them. Amy's translation equipment picked up mechanical voices speaking in mathematical patterns that hurt to listen to. Kethvar roared with anger and spoke rapidly about how the machines must have detected the activation of his ship's systems. The Void Hunters were scouts sent to investigate any signs of Vorthak technology, and they would attack without mercy. Lisa was already powering up their engines, but the alien ships were faster and would catch them before they could escape. Jake looked at their weapon systems and knew they were completely outmatched. The Horizon was an exploration vessel with only basic defensive capabilities, while the Void Hunters were pure killing machines. Kethvar was still weak from his long sleep and had no weapons other than what remained functional on his damaged ship. The first attack came without warning as energy beams that could have melted a small asteroid struck their shields. Lisa threw the ship into evasive maneuvers that would have made any pilot proud, but the machine ships adjusted their targeting faster than any organic mind could think. Bobby rerouted power from every system he could find, but their shields were failing under the constant bombardment. Jake made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of trying to run or hide, he ordered Lisa to attack the closest Void Hunter with everything they had. The alien machines were logical and predictable, which meant they could be confused by tactics that made no sense from their perspective. Lisa dove straight at the lead enemy ship, while firing their small weapons in patterns that seemed random but were actually designed to make the machines think they were dealing with a much larger threat. Jake had learned this technique during his military training, where appearing unpredictable could be more valuable than having better weapons. The Void Hunters paused for a few seconds as their computers tried to analyze the human tactics, and that pause was all Kethvar needed. The alien warrior had reached his ship's weapon controls and fired the one remaining plasma cannon that was still functional. The beam of energy struck the closest machine ship and tore through its hull like paper. Jake continued his psychological warfare by having Lisa perform maneuvers that no sane pilot would attempt. She spun the ship through a debris field, while firing in all directions and screaming over the communications channels. The Void Hunters were built to fight logical opponents who followed predictable patterns, and they had no programming for dealing with what appeared to be insane behavior. The second machine ship moved to flank them, but Jake was ready for this. He had Bobby overload their main reactor and eject the core directly at the approaching enemy. The Void Hunter tried to analyze whether this was an attack or a malfunction, and by the time it decided, the reactor core exploded close enough to damage its sensors and navigation systems. Kethvar was laughing with something that sounded like joy as he watched the humans fight in ways that defied everything he thought he knew about warfare. His people were brave and skilled, but they fought with honor and followed ancient traditions. Jake was making up new tactics on the spot and using deception and misdirection like weapons. The third Void Hunter had learned from watching its companions get damaged and was approaching more carefully. Jake realized they needed to do something completely unexpected, or they would all be killed in the next few minutes. He looked at their remaining weapons and made a choice that would have been called insane by any military court. Jake ordered Lisa to ram the enemy ship. Lisa stared at him for a moment and then grinned with the kind of expression that pilots get when they are about to do something gloriously stupid. She pushed their engines beyond safe limits and aimed directly at the machine ship's command center. The Void Hunter tried to move away, but Lisa had been flying longer than the machine had been calculating, and she knew exactly where it would go. The collision tore the front section off their ship and sent both vessels spinning through space. Emergency systems screamed warnings about hull breaches and failing life support, but they were still alive and the Void Hunter was not. Jake felt blood running down his face from where he had hit his head, but he was grinning despite the pain. Kethvar had been thrown against the bulkhead during the collision, but he was getting back to his feet and staring at Jake with an expression that mixed shock with something that might have been worship. The alien warrior spoke in his own language, and Amy's translation made Jake's heart pound with excitement and terror. Kethvar had just called him something that meant brother of the soul, and said that Jake fought like one of the legendary Vorthak heroes from their greatest stories. No alien had ever been honored with such words, and Jake had no idea what this would mean for humanity's future in a galaxy full of enemies and potential friends. Bobby was already working to patch their damaged ship while Lisa calculated a course to the nearest human outpost. They needed to report what they had learned about the Void Hunters and the alliance they had accidentally formed with the most feared warriors in the galaxy. The news that a human had been called brother by a Vorthak apex warrior spread through the galaxy faster than anyone thought possible. Every species with the ability to communicate across star systems was talking about the impossible event that had just occurred in the Kepler sector. Trade routes buzzed with rumors, and diplomatic channels carried urgent messages between homeworlds that had not spoken to each other in decades. Jake had no idea about any of this as he sat in the medical bay of their damaged ship while Amy finished treating his injuries from the collision. Kethvar remained nearby and refused to leave despite Bobby's assurances that the human would recover completely. The alien warrior seemed fascinated by Jake's ability to heal so quickly and kept asking questions about human biology that Amy could barely translate. Lisa had managed to get their communications working again after 3 days of repairs, and that was when they learned about the chaos their encounter had caused. Messages were flooding in from Earth Command demanding immediate reports and explanations for why they had made unauthorized contact with unknown aliens. Other messages came from species they had never heard of requesting information about human military capabilities and intentions. The most surprising message came from the Vorthak homeworld itself. Supreme Commander Thankor was demanding that Kethvar return immediately with the human who had been honored with brotherhood. The message was transmitted in 17 different languages to make sure every species in the galaxy understood that the Vorthak were taking this situation very seriously. Jake read through the diplomatic communications and felt overwhelmed by the implications of what had happened. Amy explained that the various alien species seemed to be divided into 3 groups based on their reactions to the news. Some were excited about the possibility of forming alliances with humans who would impress the Vorthak. Others were frightened that humanity might become a military threat if they gained access to Vorthak technology and training. The third group was simply confused because nothing like this had ever happened before in recorded galactic history. Within a week, Ambassador Elena Rodriguez arrived with a small fleet of Earth ships to take control of the situation. She was a career diplomat who had spent her life preparing for first contact scenarios, but none of her training had covered anything remotely like what Jake and his crew had stumbled into. Elena brought with her Admiral Frank Coleman and enough military advisors to start a small war. Elena interviewed Jake for hours trying to understand exactly what had happened during the battle with the Void Hunters. She was particularly interested in the tactical decisions he had made and how those decisions had impressed Kethvar enough to earn such unprecedented honor. Jake tried to explain that he had simply done what seemed necessary at the time, but Elena kept pressing for details about his military background and strategic thinking. Kethvar observed these interviews with growing impatience and finally demanded to know why the humans were questioning a proven warrior instead of celebrating his achievements. Amy translated the aliens' confusion about human bureaucracy, and Elena realized she needed to approach this situation differently. The Vorthak respected action and honor above all else, and they saw the endless questioning as an insult to Jake's proven courage. The diplomatic situation became even more complicated when representatives from other alien species began arriving to observe how humanity would handle their first major galactic crisis. The Zentari sent trade negotiators hoping to establish economic partnerships with the species that had impressed the Vorthak. The Quinn Collective dispatched scholars who wanted to study human psychology and tactical innovation. Even the usually isolationist hegemony sent observers to evaluate whether humans represented a threat or an opportunity. Elena found herself hosting the strangest diplomatic gathering in human history as dozens of alien species crowded into the space around their small fleet. Each group had their own agenda and expectations about how this unprecedented situation should be resolved. Some wanted to form immediate alliances while others demanded guarantees that humans would not share Vorthak military technology with their enemies. Through all of this political chaos, Kethvar remained focused on one thing, and that was getting Jake to the Vorthak homeworld to face the War Council. The alien warrior explained that the brotherhood he had granted was meaningless unless it was confirmed by the supreme leadership of his people. If Jake could prove himself worthy in their trials, then humanity would gain status as a brother species, with all the benefits and responsibilities that came with such recognition. Jake learned that no alien race had ever been offered such trials because the Vorthak had never considered any other species worthy of the attempt. The tests would evaluate his courage in combat, his wisdom in strategy, and most importantly, his honor when faced with impossible choices. Failure would mean not just personal death, but the end of any hope for human-Vorthak cooperation. Elena tried to convince Jake that the risk was too great and that Earth could not afford to lose him in alien trials that no human understood. She argued that they should negotiate for different terms or find ways to delay the testing until they could better prepare for what might be required. Jake listened to all of her arguments, and then politely told her that he was going to the Vorthak homeworld, whether Earth Command approved or not. Kethavar had been teaching Jake about Vorthak culture and history during their journey together. The alien warrior explained that his people valued personal honor above everything else, including life itself. A warrior who received brotherhood but refused to face the trials would be considered a coward, and the shame would extend to his entire species. Jake understood that backing down now would destroy any chance of future cooperation between humans and Vorthak. The final decision came when Supreme Commander Thanecore sent another message that was broadcast to every species in the galaxy. The Vorthak leader announced that the human called Jake Morrison would be brought before the War Council to prove his worthiness of the Brotherhood granted by Apex warrior Kethavar. The trials would be conducted according to ancient tradition and observed by representatives from across the galaxy. Elena realized that this had become much bigger than a simple diplomatic incident. The entire galactic community was watching to see how humanity would handle their first real test on the interstellar stage. Success could establish humans as a major power worthy of respect and fear. Failure could mark them as another weak species unworthy of serious consideration. Jake spent his last few days before departure training with Kethavar and learning as much as he could about Vorthak customs and expectations. The alien warrior seemed confident that Jake would succeed, but warned him that the trials would test more than just fighting ability. The War Council would be looking for proof that humans possessed the moral strength and strategic thinking that made true warriors. As they prepared to leave for the Vorthak homeworld, Jake looked out at the collection of alien ships that had gathered to witness this historic moment. He had started this journey as a simple exploration captain and somehow become the representative of his entire species in a test that would determine humanity's place in the galaxy. The Vorthak homeworld looked like a planet designed for war. Massive cities rose from mountainous terrain with buildings that seemed to grow from the rock itself. Every structure was built like a fortress with thick walls and defensive positions that could withstand orbital bombardment. Jake stared through the viewport of their transport ship and wondered how many battles had been fought in the skies above this world. Supreme Commander Thanecore stood nearly 4 meters tall and commanded respect from every Vorthak warrior in the Great Hall, where Jake was brought to face judgment. The alien leader had scars that told stories of 1,000 battles and eyes that seemed to see through any deception or weakness. Behind him sat the War Council with 12 of the most experienced apex warriors in Vorthak history. Amy stood beside Jake as his translator, while Elena and Admiral Coleman watched from a viewing area with representatives from dozens of alien species. The entire galaxy seemed to be holding its breath as they waited to see whether a human could prove worthy of brotherhood with the most feared warriors known to exist. Thanecore spoke in a voice like distant thunder, and Amy translated his words about the trials that Jake would face. The first test would measure his courage in single combat against a Vorthak champion. The second would evaluate his strategic thinking through a series of tactical scenarios. The final trial would test his honor by forcing him to choose between personal gain and protecting innocent lives. Jake had expected the combat trial to involve weapons or hand-to-hand fighting, but the Vorthak had something different in mind. They led him to a chamber filled with holographic projectors that created a virtual battlefield indistinguishable from reality. Here he would face scenarios that had been used to train Vorthak warriors for generations, and his performance would be measured against the greatest champions of their history. The first simulation put Jake in command of a small unit defending a civilian evacuation against overwhelming odds. He had to hold a mountain pass long enough for transport ships to escape, while enemy forces attacked from 3 directions. Jake used every trick he had learned during his military service, and some new ones that came to him in the heat of battle. He positioned his forces to create crossfires and used the terrain to multiply the effectiveness of his limited numbers. The Vorthak observers watched in fascination as Jake employed tactics they had never seen before. He used deception to make his small force appear larger and misdirection to attack where the enemy least expected it. When conventional weapons were not enough, he improvised explosive devices from environmental hazards and turned the mountain itself into a weapon against his enemies. The second simulation was even more challenging, as Jake found himself commanding a fleet action against superior numbers with limited resources. The Vorthak wanted to see how he would handle the kind of strategic thinking required for large-scale warfare. Jake studied the enemy formations and realized they were following predictable patterns based on mathematical optimization rather than creative thinking. He split his forces in ways that made no logical sense and attacked from directions that seemed to offer no tactical advantage. The enemy commanders tried to counter his moves, but found themselves constantly reacting to threats that appeared and disappeared faster than they could respond. Jake had learned from fighting the Void Hunters that confusion could be more valuable than raw firepower when used properly. The final combat simulation put Jake in an impossible situation where he had to rescue hostages from a facility that was rigged to explode if he made any aggressive moves. This scenario had defeated many Vorthak candidates because it required patience and subtlety rather than direct assault. Jake spent hours studying the layout and guard patterns before making his move. He infiltrated the facility using stealth, techniques that surprised the Vorthak observers, who were used to more direct approaches to problem solving. Jake disabled guards silently and used their own security systems against them to create diversions and confusion. When he finally reached the hostages, he had already neutralized most of the threats without triggering any of the explosive devices. The strategic trials were conducted in a war room where Jake faced scenarios based on actual historical conflicts that the Vorthak had fought. Each problem presented multiple solutions with no clearly correct answer, and Jake's choices were compared to those made by legendary Vorthak commanders. The alien observers were surprised when Jake's unconventional approaches often achieved better results than the traditional solutions. Jake's performance impressed the War Council, but the final trial would be the most important because it would reveal his true character. They presented him with a choice that every Vorthak warrior faced at some point in their career. He could accept a position of great power and wealth that would make him one of the most influential beings in the galaxy, or he could choose to dedicate his life to protecting those who could not protect themselves. The test was designed to be tempting, because the position they offered would allow Jake to influence policy and prevent wars before they started. He would have access to advanced technology and resources that could benefit all of humanity. The only cost would be abandoning his role as a warrior and accepting that others would have to fight the battles he was avoiding. Jake thought about the choice for exactly 3 seconds before asking what protections would be put in place for the civilian populations threatened by the Void Hunters. His response shocked the War Council because he had not even considered the personal benefits being offered. Amy translated his words about duty and responsibility that echoed the deepest beliefs of Vorthak culture. Supreme Commander Thanecore stood slowly and spoke words that had never been used for any alien species in the entire history of the Vorthak people. He declared that Jake Morrison had proven himself worthy, not just of individual brotherhood, but of representing humanity as a brother species to the Vorthak nation. The ceremony that followed was broadcast across the galaxy and marked the beginning of a new era in interstellar relations. Jake was granted the title of First Brother and given command of a joint human Vorthak fleet tasked with hunting down Void Hunter forces wherever they might be found. The alliance agreement gave humanity access to Vorthak military technology and training in exchange for human tactical innovation and strategic thinking that had proven so effective against machine enemies. The galaxy watched in amazement as the two species began working together with a level of cooperation that no one had thought possible. Other alien races started reconsidering their assumptions about both humans and Vorthak as they saw former enemies becoming allies through mutual respect and shared purpose. Jake stood on the bridge of the first hybrid human Vorthak warship ever constructed and looked out at a universe full of new possibilities. Beside him, Kethvar prepared for their first mission together, as true brothers in arms, while representatives from across the galaxy waited to see what this unprecedented alliance would accomplish next. The silence that had fallen over the galaxy when news of their brotherhood first spread was finally breaking as species everywhere began to wonder what other surprises humanity might have in store.